Hi, video 10, we're talking about Moses. Now, Abraham, through the conclusion of Genesis, essentially tells us how the 12 tribes of Israel came to be and how they got trapped in Egypt. We are starting off with the book of Exodus now. So we're now in the second book of the Bible. And Moses, who we're talking about today, the Jews see him as the author of the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, we know that to not be completely factual because we know that the first 5 books of the Bible had multiple authors. But essentially, these stories are credited to Moses, who we're going to talk about now. Now, the story of the Exodus out of Egypt is one of the most important stories to Jews. We need to understand these stories because as Christians, we are essentially descendants from Judaism. If you'll recall, Christ himself was a Jew. So we need to understand these stories. And when we start to talk about the Passover meal, if you have been attending Mass, you're going to be like, oh, wow, the Passover meal and the Catholic Mass are insanely similar, okay? This is going to be really important. This talk is probably going to be a little bit longer than the other one, so buckle down, okay? Now, how do these stories start out? So what we get at the very beginning is the Israelites are slaves in Egypt. Pharaoh tells the midwives of the Israelites, a midwife is a woman that helps another woman have a baby. So Pharaoh at the time tells the midwives, kill the Israelite babies as they're born. Why is he doing this? Well, if you think about it, if you own slaves and your slave population is getting too big for you to control and it's outnumbering you, you need to get a handle on that because the thing is they can overpower you then at one point, right? So you need to get a handle. So that's essentially what he was trying to do. He was trying to get a handle on the overpopulation of Israelites. Midwives would not do it. They would not kill the children. What they instead told Pharaoh, they're like, we cannot kill the children because these Israelite women who are having babies, they're too strong. They give birth to the babies before we ever get there. So Pharaoh sends soldiers to kill the babies as they're being born, to kill the firstborn babies. Now, this should be ringing a little bell for you because in the book of Matthew, we get this story of Jesus. At the time of his birth, the king is trying to kill him. And ultimately, he escapes, okay? So he escapes because Mary and Joseph take him someplace safe. And Moses is put in a basket by his mother, and she places him in the Nile River so that he can avoid being killed. This is really, really important on multiple levels. I don't know how many people watching this video have an understanding of Egyptian mythology, but we need to kind of have an understanding of that in order to fully appreciate this story. The Nile River, where Moses' mother placed Moses in that basket, not only is it a dangerous river, but it's also considered to be a god. The god, is it god or goddess? I believe it's a god, Happy, H-A-P-I. So Moses, who is ultimately going to assist God in defeating the Egyptian gods and bring the people to freedom, is placed in an Egyptian god. And coincidentally, that basket that Moses is in floats to where Pharaoh's own daughter finds him and she raises him. She brings him up in her household as her own. So that right there is like a holy cow. So the Egyptians from the very get-go, one of their very, very important gods is duped. He has Moses, who ultimately is going to free the slaves, right in his presence, and he doesn't stop them. He doesn't stop Moses. So anyway, so Moses makes it to Pharaoh's daughter, and he's brought up in the palace. Now, similar to kind of how things went with Jesus, we don't hear much about Moses until he's an adult. What ultimately happens, however, is while Moses is growing up, he starts to realize, okay, my family is Egyptian. I'm not. I am an Israelite, and those people are slaves. When he's an adult, he sees an Egyptian soldier beating a slave, and it enrages him. And ultimately what Moses does is he kills the Egyptian, and from there he flees. He runs out into the desert. Now, we see with Jesus, whenever he is taken with Mary and Joseph, they actually flee into Egypt to keep him from being killed. But anyway, so Moses runs off into the desert. Now, while he's in the desert, he makes a new life for himself. He meets a girl and he works as a shepherd, and he settles down. He's basically forgotten his life in Egypt. Then God comes to him, and God comes to him in a burning bush. So this is the way that God is portrayed. And one of the things that we'll need to note for a future time is when we talk about the Father, we usually, we see him as kind of like the little conductor over here. When we talk about Jesus, we refer to him as the Word. So every single time God comes, he uses words as communication, okay? So we have the Father is present and he speaks words. So just like in the creation story, how does God create? He speaks. Now, God is always present in a cloud. The cloud or the spirit and we saw this in the creation story also, is considered to be the Holy Spirit. So we always see God as a Trinity appearing. So he appears to Moses and he says, Moses, you have to go back and you have to free the slaves. Moses is, he doesn't want to do it. Obviously, I wouldn't want to do it either. But he tells him, I'm going to be with you. You have to go back and free the slaves. So ultimately Moses goes back. And the way that he is going to free the slaves is through plagues. Now, by the time Moses gets back, his brother, the one that he grew up in the palace with, is now ruling as Pharaoh. His father has passed away, or, Moses' stepfather, I guess, has passed away, and his brother is now ruling. So Moses gets an audience with his brother, and he says, you have to let the slaves go. And he does a demonstration for his brother where he has a staff that turns into a serpent and then turns back into a staff again. Now, the magicians that are in the court, they actually are able to duplicate Moses's, it's not a trick, but the miracle that Moses performs. And Pharaoh laughs and he's like, no, I'm not going to free the slaves. Okay. So next, what happens is we get a series of plagues. But what is really interesting about these plagues is every single one of them targets one of the core gods to the Egyptians. So as we go through this, you actually have an option in how you want to take this story. You can take it 100% as nonfiction. You can take it as just, here are the plagues, they happened, and exactly how the story is telling me. Now, you can take them as, okay, because first off, let me also say this, every single one of the plagues that Moses brings about with God, God working through Moses to bring about these plagues is something that actually naturally occurs in Egypt. The first plague that we're going to talk about is Moses turns the Nile River into blood. Now, something that naturally occurs there is the silt is like this red dust that it'll come to the surface of the Nile River and the water is essentially undrinkable and it's blood red. So there are also naturally occurring events that could have been utilized in the bringing about of these plagues. Or the other way you could take this is a story meant to show us that the God of the Christians, they're not Christians yet, but the God of the Israelites are stronger than the polytheistic culture, the multiple gods of the Egyptians. So anyway, you have options. Now, the first plague, as I said, that Moses brings about, he tells his brother again, he was like, free the Israelites. They are God's people, free them. Pharaoh says no. So the Nile River is turned to blood. Again, this targets the Egyptian god Happy. The next plague is a plague of frogs. So frogs descend on all of the people. And this actually targets Hecate. She is the fertility goddess. So anytime you look up Hecate, she has a frog head. This is another one of the core Egyptian gods. The next plague targets Jeb, the earth god, because the earth turns to lice. And Pharaoh will still not free the slaves. Need water, sorry. Okay, the next plague is a target at Hathor, who is she's the cow goddess, and the livestock begin to die. The next one challenges Isis, who is the goddess of medicine, and the people, their skin comes down with boils. And if you've never had a boil on you, I haven't, thank goodness, but it's almost like these sores, these open sores that cover your body. So Pharaoh still will not free the slaves. The next plague challenges the god Nut, and he is the sky god, and from the sky hail rains down on the people. Next is a storm of locusts, which challenges Seth, the storm god. And then next comes the darkness. Darkness covers Egypt, and this challenges Ra, the sun god. Now, the final plague actually it challenges Pharaoh himself, because in Egypt, they believe any pharaoh, anybody who becomes pharaoh, is also a god. So now we are to the point where Pharaoh has demonstrated a very prideful existence. Like, I am God myself. I am powerful. Of course, I am not going to give in to any of this. Pride, coincidentally, is the most deadly of the 7 deadly sins, because, I mean, you could kind of almost, I feel like I can. You can almost appreciate where Pharaoh's at. He grew up believing he himself is a god. And now his little brother, who's an Israelite, is coming back and saying, you have to free the slaves. You free all of these people. You take your workforce, where you get all of your labor, and let them go. I mean, if I considered myself to be a god, of course, it almost seems rational to be like, no, you can't. You cannot have them. They are my slaves. So we can almost commiserate a little bit. But so the final plague, Moses goes to his brother and he says, listen, your firstborn son is going to die unless you let go of the Israelites and free them. And Pharaoh's pride is so strong, he says, no, I'm not going to do it. Now, here is where we've got to buckle down and pay attention, okay? Because we're going to need this when we move on to talking about Christ and the Eucharist and why it makes sense. Because if anybody comes to you and is like, why do you think you need to eat your God? All of you should either A, know the answer, or be like, oh crap, I need to know that answer, okay? So we need to hold on to what's about to happen. Before this final plague comes, Moses goes to his people. He goes to the Israelites and he says, if we want the angel of death to pass over your household, here's what you have to do. Otherwise, your firstborns will die just like the Egyptians. And what every household had to do was to take a lamb. They had to kill it and drain the blood out of it, because the blood, for Jews, blood is life. Okay, you don't touch blood because it belongs to God, because blood equals life. It is the life source for Jews. So you don't touch it. You drain the blood out of the lamb, and then you very specifically take a hyssop branch. This hyssop branch is going to, again, come up later when we talk about Christ and his sacrifice. So you take a hyssop branch, you mark your doorpost with blood, and then you consume the lamb. Everybody in the household has to consume the lamb. And then you will follow it with a feast of unleavened bread. So again, if you attend Mass, you'll notice that the Eucharist is unleavened bread. It's like a flat cracker almost. And it's because of this. So you continue with a feast of unleavened bread. Now, during the Passover meal, there are 4 cups of wine that are drank, and they actually come from Exodus 6, because it has to do with how many times the cup is mentioned in Exodus 6. So the first cup of wine that they drink, it symbolizes sanctification. So at this Passover meal, they drink a cup of sanctification. Next is the cup of deliverance, because God is delivering the people from slavery. Third is the cup of redemption. Then after the cup of redemption, they sing the great Hallel, which in Mass, we sing the responsorial psalm, where we all repeat back one of the psalms that was written by David. They don't have that yet because it's not yet written down, okay? But that they sing a song. Then they drink the 4th cup, which is the covenant bond. So at this point, the Israelite people are making a bond with God. They're sanctifying this new covenant with God. Now, again, we're going to need to remember these 4 cups too whenever we get to the next part, because it's extremely important. So the Israelites do this, and then the angel of death passes over them, and Pharaoh's son is killed. So next what happens is Pharaoh gives up, essentially, and he says, they're yours, like, take the slaves, get out. And they do, they flee. Now, once the Israelites flee, they make it to the desert. This is probably one of the most confusing points, because the Israelites have been waiting for God to fulfill the promises that he'd made to Abraham. Give them land, give them a safe place to stay. The promised land is what they're looking for, and they're finally free. Then God leads them in the desert and they wander for 40 years. So I'm just, again, kind of like in the beginning, we have to understand these stories, because just like when we talked about Adam and Eve, why did God put a tree that could kill them in the middle of the garden? Like, I would never put something poisonous in front of one of my children and be like, don't eat that. Okay, we got to get what the point of this story is. Now, the term desert in the original translation is midbar. That's the word that's used, midbar. Now, we translate it to desert, but what it actually is a place of rehabilitation. So we often would hear about shepherds taking their livestock to the midbar. What that was is it's a safe place that has plenty of food, plenty of water. There's usually geographical walls, I guess you could say, to protect the livestock so the animals can rest. Now, the Israelites are free, and Moses takes the Israelites to the midbar. Why? If you were a slave, essentially your entire life, and you grew up in a different culture, you are a person who is in need of rehabilitation. There's something about you in that moment that needs to be changed, okay? Replenished, revived, whatever. So the Israelites are taken to the midbar. And when they're in the midbar, Moses is, they need to eat. So what happens is manna, it's this heavenly bread, would come to rest on the surface. So every morning when the Israelites were in the desert, they would wake up and they were told to gather only as much manna as you need for that day. They would go out, gather it up, and that's what fed them. Now, when we're talking about a midbar, when we're talking about rehabilitation, this is kind of amazing. If you told me, if we all have the pandemic, okay, that we can now relate to, we were telling everybody during the pandemic, do not hoard items, but we did that. Everyone was, now we get to talk about the great toilet paper shortage of 2020, but everyone was hoarding because they were afraid and they wanted to take care of themselves. So the Israelites are in recovery now, and they are told only take as much food as you need for one day, because now they are into a new cycle of trust with God. I'm going to provide for you. You only need what you need for one day, and then tomorrow you're going to have more food. So this is, wow. It's kind of a, an eye-opening situation when it comes to, trusting God. Now, I want to make a couple more typology notes here before we end this video. And what I want your writing prompts for your journal to be is I want you to point out the typology of the story. So we already had some in the beginning, and now this part. The very first plague that is worked through Moses, from God through Moses, is the Nile rivers turn to blood. Now, what is the very first miracle that Jesus works? Well, it is the wedding at Cana. So what Jesus does is he takes water and turns it to wine, and then that wine ultimately becomes not the wine at the wedding. They weren't drinking blood at the wedding, but that wine is ultimately what's going to become the blood of life for us. So this is another very big typological moment. The Nile River turns to blood, Christ turns water to wine, okay? And we know wine is extremely significant. Then the 12 tribes of Judah who were enslaved in Egypt. When Jesus comes, I was about to say out of retirement. I don't even know where that was coming from. But when Jesus' ministry first begins, he selects 12 apostles. And this isn't just some oh, what a funny coincidence. It is because these stories are connecting themselves, okay? So we have to understand the Old Testament is hidden in the New Testament and vice versa, okay? They are joined together. We can't separate them. So record these in your journal. I hope you enjoy this video. Next, and there's so many other things that happen with Moses and typology and Jesus about, everything, but that's to come. So next, what we're going to talk about is David, because what happens with these people is they no longer want to be ruled the way they're being ruled, and they want a king. And the king that they get is Saul, and he's awful. And so we're going to talk about David to come next. So that's our Moses story. Ultimately, they make it to the promised land. We'll pick up there. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it was long. None of the other ones will be this long. So until video 11, have a wonderful whatever it is you're